Henry, who moved the family line from Rothwell to Kellington, was the son of Samuel and Elizabeth Farrar. He was born at Rothwell in 1743, and at the age of 21 he married Elizabeth, the daughter of Matthew and Elizabeth Horsfall. Their first two children, Elizabeth and Hannah, were baptised at Rothwell Church, and shortly afterwards he left his father and younger brother to continue the family business, and he moved to Kellington, where a further 7 children were baptised. The final break with Rothwell appears to have been in 1782, when Henry released his interest in the family home. The deed indicated that the house, marked here in red, stood between Marsh and Town Street, on land formerly belonging to his great-great-grandfather. All that was left in the 20th century was a section of stone walling, which may have been part of the original buildings. The house at Kellington can be identified as Oglethorpe Hall, a substantial L-shaped farmhouse which stood on land with a mulberry tree in the garden. The house has gone, but in the 1950s the tree was still standing. However, within a few years only the trunk had survived. Oglethorpe Hall was part of a farm leased by Henry Farrar from Lord Lascelles of Harewood House. Later accounts for the farm show that he and Mark Poskett paid £142 rent annually. The relationship between Henry and Mark Poskett was not confined to business. In 1789, Henry's eldest daughter, Elizabeth, married Mark Poskett in Kellington Church. This wedding was followed 6 years later, when the eldest son, Henry, married Elizabeth Townend, and 3 years later, a daughter, Alice, married Edward Connor of Prestwick in Cheshire. Then, Joseph married Elizabeth Motherby. When he was in his mid-50s, Henry made his will. He was described as a butcher, the same occupation as his father in Rothwell. In January 1799, he died and was buried in Kellington churchyard. All his estate was inherited by his wife, Elizabeth, with instructions that after her death his assets should be sold and the money divided amongst the children. His estate was then valued at £352. Henry, the eldest son, continued to run the farm on his mother's behalf, while the young siblings were growing up and planning their own future. In 1800, Hannah married Richard Harding of Pontefract, and they subsequently moved to Wakefield to manage a china and glass shop. Shortly afterwards, Samuel married Mary Moody and moved to Ackworth, where he worked on a farm. His brother, Matthew, went to Ackworth in November 1808 to marry Anne Cuttle. Later he became a butcher at Haddlesey. Jonathan, the youngest son, married Mary Kilby, and their first child was baptised at Womersley. Only John remained unmarried. He was working on the farm at Kellington when his mother, Elizabeth, died. She was buried next to her husband in Kellington churchyard. Her death seems to have triggered a turning point in the family. All the children were due to inherit a portion of their father's estate, not a huge sum, but enough money to buy a ticket on a sailing ship to America. This was a time when the population of America was expanding. Adverts were appearing in the local paper offering passages to those wishing to emigrate and begin a new life. The cheapest ticket cost only £2 or £3. Henry, the eldest son, decided to take advantage and took a ship to America. His wife died there and he remarried, but died shortly afterwards. He had no children. His sister, Alice, who had married Edward Connor, also emigrated. They had 2 sons. Joseph and his wife, Elizabeth, had 11 children, but 3 died young, and all the family emigrated to America. Samuel, who worked on the farm at Ackworth, had 4 children, but 2 died young, and their mother, Mary, also died. She was aged 28 when buried in Darrington churchyard. Samuel then married Anne Eliza Dyson, but she died shortly afterwards, and he decided to take the 2 sons to America. Eventually he returned to England, where in the summer of 1833 he married Mary Denby at Snaith Church. His wife owned several properties in Snaith parish, and they took up residence in one of the houses in Grange Road in West Cowick. They were recorded living there when the 1851 census was taken. Samuel, aged 73, was described as a land and house proprietor, and when he was buried in Snaith Church shortly afterwards, he was described as a gentleman. Matthew, his wife Anne, and 3 children also emigrated to America. And then in the spring of 1820, the youngest sibling, Jonathan, embarked on a sailing ship to Baltimore. His adventures are the subject of a separate video. Only 3 of the siblings stayed in England. Elizabeth, who had married Mark Poskett, gave birth to 7 children. She was a widow, aged 86, when the census was taken at Kellington in 1841. Also in the house was her sister, Hannah, who had married Richard Hardy. He died, aged 55, and was buried at Kellington. Hannah died 3 years after the census and was buried next to her husband. John, the only son to stay in England, took management of the Kellington farm. Within a few years, he married Anne Wallace at Womersley Church. Anne gave her residence as Smeaton Parva, but she was the daughter of Robert and Elizabeth Wallace, who were farmers of Clayworth in Nottinghamshire. John and Anne had 12 children, all baptised at Kellington. Jane, the youngest daughter, only survived about 3 weeks, and Henry, the eldest boy, died a few days short of his 18th birthday. At the age of 59, John contracted erysipelas, a skin infection from which he died. He was buried at Kellington churchyard, and the memorial stone also bears the names of the children who died young. Anne was 15 years younger than her husband and left to take care of the large family herself, though her elder children were growing up and would have been able to help. When the census was taken in 1841, 9 children and 2 servants were living in the house. Only Samuel was not at home. Whereas the previous generation of children had sought a new life in America, all but John, the eldest son of the new generation, decided to give up the land and take advantage of the booming trade and commerce caused by the Industrial Revolution. Samuel was the first to leave Kellington to become an apprentice draper to William Newby of Snaith. 10 years later, he had moved to Bridlington and was employed by Thomas Stephenson as an assistant tea dealer. The 1861 census showed that he had left Bridlington and was running a grocery shop at Pontefract Marketplace. Also in the house were his brother, Robert William, and their sister, Anne. Later that year, In Pontefract Church, Samuel married Catherine Jackson, and he and his wife moved to Great Driffield, where he managed a grocery shop. 10 years later, aged 55, he was in lodgings and working as an assistant builder at Lichfield in Staffordshire, while his wife was staying with her sister at Kirksmeaton. Samuel died in October 1889 at Pontefract Workhouse. His wife died 3 years later. Anne, the first daughter to leave home, was aged 24 and working as a housekeeper at Sandal Grange. Sandal Grange was eventually pulled down. 10 years later, Anne was at Pontefract, having become a housekeeper to her brother Samuel. Shortly afterwards, at Pontefract Church, she married a cousin, Charles Wallace. They settled at Torksey in a house which became known as Grange Farm. They both lived to a good age. Charles died aged 77, and his wife Anne died 3 months later, aged 86. In 1855, Jonathan married Margaret Ann Hepworth at Snaith and subsequently moved to Pontefract, where he worked as a draper in the marketplace. His wife, Margaret Ann, gave birth to 3 children, 2 daughters and a son, William. William became a banker's clerk, while his sister, Anne Louise, married Arthur Jessup, who also worked as a banker's clerk. Jonathan continued in the drapery trade and in 1881 was in lodgings at Hull and described as a woolen draper. 10 years later, he had retired and living with his wife at Beesfair in Snaith. By 1901, they had moved to Morwick Terrace near Barwick and Elmet. Living next door was their daughter, Anne Louise Jessup. At the age of 20, Mary was at Cowick working for her Uncle Samuel, who had returned from America. 6 years later, at the Holy Trinity Church at Cowick, she married Elijah Barrett. They moved into the Snaith marketplace, where he worked as a plumber and a glazier, and where 5 children were born. Ellen appears not to have married and may have stayed at home until after her mother's death. At the age of 30, she was working as a housekeeper to Oliver Ellis at South Ossett. In the next census, she was a housekeeper to Joseph Wood, a maltster and farmer in Blacker Lane at Grigglestone. 10 years later, she was still employed by Joseph Wood, then a pensioner aged 78. No trace of Ellen has been found after 1881. Robert William was recorded as a draper's apprentice at Bradford in 1851. 10 years later, he was working with his brother Samuel at Pontefract. Following this, he became a grocery journeyman and in lodgings at Tuxford, a village in Nottinghamshire not far from where his mother was born. William, the youngest boy, entered the drapery trade and became an apprentice at Cheeseman's shop in Selby. After he qualified, he worked as a linen draper at Cleckheaton. In 1871, he was in lodgings at Hull and described as a hosier. There is no trace of William after the 1881 census. John, the eldest surviving son, helped his mother manage the farm at Kellington. In 1850, he paid Lord Harewood £210 rent and may have attended the annual tenants' dinner at Harewood House. He sold some hogs in Wakefield Market and received 12 and 9pence a stone for wool, and £32 for the duties involved as Deputy Overseer for the Poor. In 1851 he acted as enumerator for the census returns taken at Kellington that year. Anne was head of the household and only 4 children were still at home. John and his 3 sisters. Also in the house were John and Robert Wallace, 2 of Anne's nephews, and 2 farm servants, Matthew Hall and George Gillian. In 1851, John's aunt Elizabeth Poskett died. 2 years later, Oglethorpe Hall was the scene of the family reunion when his uncle, Jonathan, who had emigrated 33 years earlier, had supper there. There were 2 marriages to celebrate in 1855. Hannah married Joseph Baker, a local blacksmith at Kellington, and in April John went to Normanton-on-Trent to marry his cousin, 24-year-old Caroline Wilkinson. Caroline was born in this house at Skegby, the daughter of William Wilkinson, a Nottinghamshire farmer. His wife, Elizabeth, was John's mother's sister. John and Caroline's first child, Henry, was born in June 1856. In that year, John's elder sister, Elizabeth, died aged 36. The following year, his mother, Anne, died due to apoplexy. Both are remembered on the memorial stone at Kellington. Only John and Hannah remained in Kellington, but eventually he was forced to leave. In 1860, the 4th Earl of Harewood decided to sell Oglethorpe Hall. It was purchased by Samuel Hurst, a local farmer and surveyor. John took another farm belonging to the Harewood estate, Rudding House at Brackenthwaite near Harrogate. In April 1860, after attending church, Mr. Hurst wrote in his diary, "I suppose this will be the last Sunday John Farrar will be in Kellington. Poor young man, I wish him well." The following day John visited Mr. Hurst to settle the constable's accounts, and 2 days later Hurst sent George Copley with a wagon and horses to take John's goods to Nottingham Station. He wrote in his diary, "John Farrar has left us today and gone. I am sorry to part with him." But John and Caroline did return to Kellington in August for the baptism of their second son, who they named John after his father. Now only John's sister Hannah remained in Kellington. She had married Joseph Baker and had 3 children before her death at the age of 40. Oglethorpe Hall must have been in a poor state. Within a few years of John leaving, Mr. Hurst wrote he was pulling Thatcher Farrars' old buildings. The hall itself was dismantled in 1870. The mulberry tree, which stood in the garden, lived on for another 100 years or so, and finally fell in the 1970s. With John's move to Brackenthwaite and the death of his sister Hannah, none of the family remained at Kellington. After nearly 100 years and 3 generations, all the Farrars had left the village.